2017, a working day in the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, and the topic of our press conference is Euromaidan and the Donbas war in Italian media. We have Massimiliano Di Pasquale, freelance journalist, writer, author of the book Ukraine Borderland, Trips in the Unknown Europe. Our press conference will be in English. Those who need translation, please take your headsets at the end of the room.
My name is Massimiliano Di Pasquale. I'm a freelance writer and journalist, and I've been writing now about Ukrainian culture and politics and history for more than a decade. And the speech I'm going to present today is about the way Euromaidan and the Donbas war has been portrayed by the Italian press in the last 2 years. So I would like to start as soon as possible because I have lots of things to say, and I'd like to be on time. First of all, I'd like to start with a little bit of background because it's important to understand the current situation. So let's start from 1991. In 1991, when Ukraine gained its independence, the new nation, which came as a surprise in the chancelleries and the university and the boardrooms in the West, was more unexpected than elsewhere in Italy. Why? Italy had always had a privileged relationship with Soviet Union, both in the economic and political sphere, and struggled to come to terms with the idea of Ukraine as an independent nation. Despite the fact the USSR was a federal union of 15 constituent republics, Italian intelligentsia had often identified Soviet Union with Russia. So Soviet Union and Russia were frequently used as synonymous by the Italian politicians and journalists, generating misunderstanding and confusion amongst the general public. So until the Orange Revolution of 2004, Ukraine was nearly nowhere to be found in the Italian newspaper, magazines, and TV news. The only exception to this general trend was the geopolitical magazine Limes, which from the early 90s started publishing some articles about Ukraine. In the vast majority of these writings, Ukraine was portrayed as a sort of an appendix of Russia that sooner or later would have joined or forced to join Russian Federation, or in the worst case scenario, split up into halves. Apart from some qualified exception, the so-called Ukrainian specialists, the so-called Ukrainian experts writing on Limes were mostly former correspondents from Moscow during the Soviet time, or even Kremlin consultants. So their writings were mostly sort of a copy and paste of articles coming from the Russian media, and to a far less degree from Western sources. This showed that Italy had a problem. Italy lacked experts on Ukraine, or even the few experts were not invited to contribute to this magazine. So in November 2004, when the protest known as Euromaidan, as the Orange Revolution, hit the road of downtown Kiev, many Italians heard for the first time of a country called Ukraine. That was not Russia, was not Soviet Union, but it was Ukraine. Italian newspapers and radios and TV news broadcast the events in Kiev with their Moscow correspondents. So the lack of knowledge about Ukrainian history and politics, along with the fact that the events were covered using information coming from Russian television and press, led to a biased narration. The situation was so embarrassing that the president of the Italian Association for Ukrainian Studies, Giovanna Brogi, sent an open letter to the directors of Rai TV, which is the Italian National Public Broadcasting Company, asking for a more balanced coverage of what was happening in Ukraine. If Rai were not able to send a correspondent to Kiev, at least they could also broadcast from time to time the news coming from Warsaw, not just from Moscow. Nobody replied to this open letter that was published in the most important Italian newspaper, which is Corriere della Sera. On the 28th of November 2004, in an article entitled Putin's Thorn, former Italian ambassador to Moscow and famous historian Sergio Romano claimed that the European Union had to reassure Putin that Ukraine would never be a Polish thorn in the side of the Russian state. Apparently, the democratic aspirations of Ukrainian people count for nothing compared to the indisputable interests of Vladimir Putin. In summer 2007, when there was this harsh confrontation between Viktor Yushchenko, the President Viktor Yushchenko, and Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych, many political commentators in Italy depicted the dramatic clash between the democratic forces and the post-communist ones as a rivalry between Russia and Ukraine. It was a very poor analysis. Ukrainian scholar Oksana Paklovska pointed out that these misleading analyses were in line with Italian pro-Russian foreign policy. The main problem was not the lack of honest journalists. For sure, there were some honest journalists even in Italy, but the ambiguity of the relationship between Italy and Russia. Italy appeared more interested in getting gas contracts with Gazprom and not to disappoint Putin, and actually in pleasing Vladimir Putin, like the then Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi did when he claimed Russia is one of the most democratic countries in the world. That's what he said. But in order to understand the climate that will surround the Italian media when Euromaidan breaks out in November 2013, we need to go back to 2008. 2008 is a pivotal year for the geopolitics of the post-Soviet space. The conflict in Georgia of August 2008 can be viewed as the first wider trial war by the Kremlin. A new kind of war. We can name it a hybrid war, which is fought with different weapons: military action, terrorism, disinformation, and cyber terrorism. At the core of this project stands a unique idea of geopolitics. According to Kremlin consultant Alexander Dugin and Vladislav Surkov, geopolitics is a worldview of power, the science of power for power. Small states are subjects that do not deserve sovereignty. Sovereignty comes from strength, not from international law. This unique concept of geopolitics as the balance of power was carried out in Italy also by Limes, starting in 2008 with the number 3 called Project Russia. Limes began to present its readers with maps of Ukraine dismembered in different areas and articles entitled How to Dismember Ukraine and How to Dismember Georgia. For the first time, a well-known geopolitical magazine was questioning the legitimacy of Ukrainian borders, borrowing Putin's famous statement, Ukraine is not even a state. A year later, in 2009, Limes published a volume called Eurasia, Our Future, that aside from a couple of serious articles can be viewed as an apologetic manifesto of Eurasian project. Amongst its contributors, we can spot the names of several Kremlin businessmen and consultants, such as Fyodor Lukyanov, Alexander Medvedev, Alexei Miller, Vitaly Tretьяков, Mikhail Remizov, and so on. The same year, Bocconi University Press published the Italian version of Edward Lucas' The New Cold War, a very interesting book that analyzed in depth the nature of Putin's regime, arguing that the West still underestimated the danger posed by Moscow. This prophetic book, which among other things anticipated in some ways the war scenario in Ukraine and the hybrid war in the rest of the former USSR, was accompanied by a foreword written once again by historian Sergio Romano that harshly criticized Lucas' thesis. Romano accused Lucas to be Russophobic and maintained this book was a deliberate provocation to humiliate Russia. Romano, on the contrary, praised Russian new course, stating Putin's men were clever and skilled because they came from an old Soviet institution, KGB. In 2012, when Ukraine was about to co-host with Poland Euro 2012 football tournament, newspapers in Italy were more concerned with the killing of stray dogs to clean up the streets rather than with the violation of human rights under Yanukovych's presidency. The Tymoshenko case, which got international press coverage, with some EU countries threatening to boycott Euro 2012 if she wasn't released from jail, was either ignored or portrayed simply as a war between different oligarchs. Only few independent journalists expressed their concern about the downgrade of Ukrainian democracy, whilst the majority of them did not care at all of the political motivated convictions of Tymoshenko and former Interior Minister Yuri Lutsenko. So when in November 2013, the first wave of protests known as Euromaidan began in Kiev, in Italy the so-called template for a biased narration of the events had already been set. As the situation in Kiev worsened, what was initially just a pro-Russian standpoint, partly due to poor knowledge of Ukrainian politics, turned into a Moscow-centric narration. None of the major TV channels and newspapers was immune to it. Even Corriere della Sera and Repubblica, the most important newspapers, along with balanced articles, publish reportage and editorials that convey exactly the same rhetoric of Russian media. The only positive exception was Turin La Stampa, which provided its readers with balanced information and good analysis of what was happening in Ukraine. Right-wing Il Giornale, owned by tycoon Berlusconi, close friend of Vladimir Putin, and the communist newspaper Il Manifesto, despite being ideologically on opposite sides, described Ukrainian people demonstrating in Kiev as right-wing extremists. They completely ignored the evidence that the majority of them were common citizens fighting peacefully, at least at the beginning of the rallies, against government corruption, abuse of power, and violation of human rights. When on the 20th of February 2014, Olesia Zhukovska, a volunteer medic, was hit by pro-government snipers around Kiev's Independence Square, the Italian newspaper Il Manifesto titled on its front page, "Ukraine, the nurse is alive and she is a Nazi." The situation was slightly better on TV, with some networks trying to do a decent job. For instance, Rai News 24 sent a correspondent to Kiev and hosted in his studios in Rome some Ukrainian and Russian scholars to provide the audience with a bigger picture. But by the time Russia had taken control of Crimea, Rai News 24 had already changed its correspondent in Ukraine and its editorial line. Aside from a few isolated voices, even well-known Italian historians and philosophers appear to be in line with the Russian version of the facts, or simply not to care too much, or not to care at all, of the new Russian imperialism that was reshaping the borders of Europe for the first time since the end of World War II. A week before the start of the war in the Donbas, historian and medievalist Franco Cardini, interviewed by Libero, a popular newspaper, went as far as defining Euromaidan like a Ukrainian-Polish coup d'etat orchestrated by US. According to Franco Cardini, the people in Maidan Nezalezhnosti were Nazis. So when the conflict between the troops loyal to the new government in Kiev and the Donbas separatists started out, the vast majority of the Italian media was already aligned with Moscow narration. In many newspapers and online publications, the government in Kiev was defined a Nazi junta using the same language that could be found in the Russian press. Even the most important national newspapers were not so interested in investigating what was really going on in Donbas. They preferred to call the conflict a civil war, despite the clear evidence that the so-called separatists were in large proportion troops sent from Russia. When Lucia Gorach, the Donbas correspondent of Rai News 24, was stopped in the center of Donetsk by a truck full of Kadyrovtsi who pointed their Kalashnikovs against her and her collaborators, she was forced to admit that Russia was sending mercenaries in Ukraine. But even Italian National Public Broadcasting Company was not immune to this massive wave of Russian propaganda. I'll give you an example. The reportage Fratello contro Fratello, Brother Against Brother, broadcast on Rai second channel the 21st of February 2015, was a clear example of Kremlin-orchestrated propaganda. This video, which had caused several protests by Ukrainian Association, by the Ukrainian Embassy and Ukrainian institution in Italy stressed on the following concept. First, the conflict in Ukraine is a civil war. Second, Kiev is ruled by a Nazi junta. Third, the Donbas fighters of LNR and DNR are anti-fascist patriots. Fourth, sooner or later, Donbas will be liberated by the patriotic forces and will be part, along with Crimea and southeastern Ukraine, of Novorossiya. So what was happening in Italy looked literally like an Orwellian nightmare. Italy was the main playing field, or at least one of the main playing fields of Kremlin propaganda. Russian cultural associations were extremely active in spreading their disinformation using different channels according to different audiences. They arranged conferences, employed hundreds of trolls on Facebook, used testimonials like Nikolai Lilin, a Transnistria writer who was quite popular in Italy, for fiction novel, portraying him as a Ukrainian expert. Whilst other European countries organized public events with Ukrainian scholars to analyze the Ukrainian crisis, Italy preferred to host conferences with Alexander Dugin and other Russian ideologists. The most hilarious things was a conference about Ukraine entitled Ukraine Regional Crisis in the Global Geopolitical Context, which was co-hosted by Limes, the geopolitical magazine, and a Russian embassy in Italy, that took place in Rome on the 24th of September 2015, where, despite the subject Ukraine, no Ukrainian scholar was invited. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the report. We have only one question. Are there any? Is there any?
Grazie mille. I ask on English. You write very deep analysis, but what you recommend to our government or our citizens, what we can do by ourselves to correct Italian mind?
Yes, thanks for this question. I think it's a very interesting question. I think there is a lot of work to do, and I think the Ukrainian government should invest a lot of soft power energies, soft power resources in order to increase the knowledge and the perception of Ukraine in Italy. That means, for example, the institution of Ukrainian Cultural Center in Italy that could organize events. So I think that the most important thing to cut shortly is to invest on culture, which means letting Italian people know that there is a Ukrainian culture, that there are Ukrainian writers, and that Ukraine is not just folklore. Because so far something has been done, but targeted the low level. Well, I think it's time to stop with the Vyshyvanka thing and try to target different audiences with a higher profile level.
The last question.
Buongiorno, тільки буду говорити українською.
Mr. Pasquale, so Alena Nazarenko, coordinator of Civil Information Resource, Euromaidan PI in Italy, and I would like to ask two questions about Ukraine should support such independent experts like you, because Russia has many so-called experts, and do you believe that it is important that Ukraine should translate books and the most important works on history of Ukraine in Italian? Because history of Ukraine is not studied in Italy, and what is your opinion that this campaign should be directed at the Italian youth? The information policy of Ukraine should be directed at young people in Italy, because this is a part of society that is pro-European, pro-integrational aspirations of Ukraine. So they do not have communist nostalgia, and they want to live in Europe for everyone. Thank you.
Italy should translate some important books about Ukrainian history. Actually, there's only one big book about Ukrainian history and culture, which is Civiltà letteraria Ucraina by Oksana Paklowska, but this is a book written almost 20 years ago. And also there are some other books. I wrote some of the books, but I don't want to advertise for myself here, of course. But apart from that, I would say that, yes, there are some important texts that should be translated into Italian, but the problem is that we need to find editors that are interested in this. So in order to find editors that are interested in translating Ukrainian books, we need to work on what I was saying before, on the soft power and on lobbying the Ukrainian image, the right image of Ukraine.
Thank you for coming, and I guess at this point we'll be finishing because another press conference is coming in a couple of minutes. Thank you for coming, and looking forward to seeing you here in the nearest future.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Шановні колеги,